everyone. In this unit of this Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, we're going to talk about work. And we're going to do this by analyzing an ethnography of workers in a garbage dump in a neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The ethnography was conducted by anthropologist Kathleen Miller, and it was published in 2015 in a book entitled Reclaiming the Discarded. So let's start with a question. How do you define or understand work? And specifically, can you give an example of an activity that you consider to be work, and then an activity that you consider to not be work, and what marks them as distinct? In her research, Miller was specifically interested in the phenomenology, meaning the experience of work, and broadly to think of work as a form of living, and we're going to get back to this in a little bit. So she's interested in what it feels like to be working, and in workers' own narratives or commentaries and claims about what they're doing and what it feels like and why they do it. So work for Miller is really a form of livelihood, and also, and I'm quoting here from page 12, it's a key side of struggle in everyday efforts to construct the good, in the sense of what it's valued, desired, and aimed for in the living out of a life. Miller's ethnography centers on Jardim Gramacho, a garbage dump just outside of the center of Rio de Janeiro. And this place was once a mangrove swamp and then a site of agriculture, of logging. It was later developed as a neighborhood, and it's surrounded by heavy industries. And in the 1970s, it was designated as the city's garbage dump. And this dump was closed down in 2013. For her research, Miller worked alongside a community of pickers. They're called catadores. These are about 2,000 men and women. They collect recyclable items from the Jardim Gramacho dump. They look for metal specifically, and plastic and paper, and then they sell them to scrap yards in the neighborhoods or to intermediaries who then sell them to scrap yards. So the first catadores in the 1970s were rural Brazilian migrants to the city of Rio. They were displaced from the Brazilian countryside with the mechanization of sugarcane agriculture. However, once they got in the city, they didn't find the employment opportunities that they hoped to find, despite Brazil's growing industrial economy. In fact, by the 1990s, employment opportunities in the city were increasingly precarious and temporary, particularly for these low-skilled rural migrants. And people often became garbage pickers after having lost a job or after a family member's job loss. Brazil experienced a very low unemployment rate after the economic expansion of the early 2000s. However, most jobs paid much less than a living wage. And of course, the distribution of jobs, and particularly of good jobs, falls alongside racial and gender lines in intersecting ways, with the indigenous and non-white Brazilian men and women largely working, and other genders largely working in the so-called informal economy. In Jardim de Gramacho, the catadores were not necessarily locals. Typically, they lived in faraway neighborhoods in Rio or even in other municipalities, and they rented tiny plywood cabins and worked in the dumps for a few days or weeks at a time, and then returned home for days or weeks and then back to the dump. There was a constant kind of coming and going. And the work that the catadores do in the dump is usually described as being part of the informal economy. These are workers who work without a contract or stable wages. There are temporary workers, there are the urban poor, migrant populations. And the informal garbage scavenger or garbage picker is really an icon of the large class of informal workers in the world's cities. So the end of stable employment and the end of stable salaried employment in the last decades of the 20th century has given rise everywhere to what has recently been theorized as the precariat. The precariat is a term that combines the terms precarious and proletariat. And the precariat is a condition of people always in between jobs, moving from one temp job to the other. And in the global south, the rise of the precariat is also accompanied by the rapid growth of megacities and the expansion of urban slums. My second question for you is, have you experienced or taken part in forms of precarious employment? And what did that feel like? What did that look like? And what were some of the values and aspirations that you brought into the work, and what were some of the drawbacks? So in her research, Millar encountered the puzzle. So picking recyclables in the dump is fairly painful and dangerous work. The rewards can really be high, but there is no economic security there. And so at first she asked, why did the catadores keep going back to the garbage dump? And one could presume that this is because of financial need, or the need to survive, or that the catadores didn't have any other choice. However, this wasn't actually exactly true. And so Millar moved to ask different research questions. She asked, why did the catadores come to take up this work in the first place? And how does the time that they spend working in the garbage dump fit within their larger life trajectories? And she argues we really do need to understand these longer life trajectories and the experience of work to situate the experience of precarious urban economies. So instead of understanding catadores as superfluous to the city's economy, as discarded members of the society, Millar argues we need to understand this work as connected to and part of local economies and political life. And so instead of focusing on theorizing catadores' lives, on assumptions of scarcity and need, Millar proposed to instead shift attention to their values, the social relations, the subjectivities, and the life worlds that are made possible in the garbage dump. The bigger question for Millar is, how does life become livable through work? And hers is an expansive understanding of work, not just wage work, but work in the sense of sustaining livelihoods, crafting ways of living, work as an experience that shapes ways of being in the world. This is what the phenomenology of work means. And so to answer these kind of questions about the phenomenology of work, the method of participant observation was really key. With the catadores' guidance, Millar learned to collect recyclables from the dump, holding conversation with the catadores while working side by side. The knowledge that one acquires or needs to acquire in order to be able to do this kind of work is tacit knowledge, meaning it's a kind of knowledge that is embodied, it's acquired through practice and experience, it's informal, there's no book of rules about how to collect recyclables in a garbage dump, and it's collective. And it's a kind of work that also reshapes one's own bodily sensations and daily rhythms, and as well as ways of being in the world. So Millar accompanied catadores in their everyday lives, outside of the garbage dump, in their nearby shacks, and in their other city homes. She also became involved in and studied a newly founded Catadores Association and Recycling Cooperative. This was an arrangement that allowed cooperative members to bypass the intermediary scrap dealers. And this organization was a really important one, an important connection that allows Millar to conduct her research. However, she was also very careful not to focus her research entirely on the association. So often scholars are drawn to study social movements and activism and formal institutions or NGOs. However, there are many other collaborative projects and everyday politics of work that are at play among the widest catadores communities. Not everyone is involved in the association. And so this is why Millar only focused part of her work on this collective. And the work of sorting through garbage in the dump is hard for the catadores, as is for the anthropologist. And Millar shares her recognition that of her own positionality, that the anthropological method of participant observation are not really commensurate with her interlocutor's lifetime work experience in the dump. There's not one kind of homogeneous shared catadores collective experience of the landfill, but their experiences are multiple and they're always changing over the course of their lives. So for example, catadores all have stories about their first day and their first weeks in the dump, experiencing garbage as disgusting, as abject. There are stories about the grotesque things that they found, and how eventually these feelings of disgust and repulsion gave way to a tacit knowledge about which materials to pick and how to strategize about selling them to intermediaries, which supplies to take to the garbage dump, how to get there, and thinking about the changing market prices of paper, plastic, and metal. So in time, the catadores learned to see the dump as a rich collection of things and not just an overwhelming pile of garbage. And many of the stories that the Catadores told about their work and learning to work relied on metaphors of burial grounds, discarded objects are buried in the dump like dead bodies in a graveyard. And this was a recurrent image in the Catadores stories. Millar encountered countless stories of cadavers and body parts found in the dump, as well as really tragic stories of the Catadores' own death, buried in the garbage. So the stakes of life and death in the dump are high, and the dump is sometimes experienced as a liminal place. The stories depict the dump as a liminal burial ground one has to enter to reclaim what's there. But the dump is also a refuge, it's not just a graveyard. Secure employment in Rio stands in contrast with the instability and uncertainty of everyday life in the city's outskirts and in the favelas. And the flexibility and self-directed nature of the Catadores' work can provide an important lifeline, allowing pickers to sustain their families, to maintain and fulfill and nurture social relationships and obligations, and pursue their life projects. So Catadores often say the dump has a good side and a bad side. And the good side is that the workers can decide how much and when to work. So in the sense, this is different from the precarity of temp jobs or in the gig economy, where work and wages might be unpredictable, but workers are not in control of their own hours and time. And so approaching Catadores' work as part of their more complex life stories, Millar learned that their work was characterized by constant coming and going. The Catadores leave the dump for other jobs and then return, and over the course of a life they experience moving between more stable working class jobs and then times of instability, usually because of an unexpected, unpredictable life event, everyday emergency that stem from their multiple and intersecting insecurities of the Catadores' lives. And there is a tension between the desire for stable employment and the desire for what Millar calls relational autonomy, that kind of fluidity, flexibility, and freedom of work in the landfill. And Catadores also hold their own theories of value and money. And in particular, they talk a lot about the money earned and the money spent. Money is spent very quickly. And they hold certain types of money as cursed, and money that shouldn't really be held or shouldn't be spent in immoral ways. As money comes quickly, it vanishes quickly. And local moral expectations about how one should spend money in specific ways, for example, to contribute to the well-being of others by sharing and offering meals, but also to live well oneself through the enjoyment of life's pleasures. One of the biggest takeaways from this book is not to think about work as simply an end for itself or an end for economic gains, but to think of work as an embodied relational experience, one that must be understood within an individual's lifespan, and one that is important and really central to one's sense of self, subjecthood, and life world. So this is all for today. I look forward to seeing you all very soon.